New Year's Eve was always frenetic in New York City, and Times Square buzzed with the energy of a million souls waiting for the clock to strike midnight. Among the crowd, Detective Jenna Morales stood watch, her eyes scanning the masses. She wasn't here to celebrate. She was here to stop a killer. For weeks, the Sculptor of Time had turned the city into their personal theater of terror. Each murder was staged at a different iconic location, and each victim clutched a golden clock frozen at a specific hour. With 3 victims already discovered, the sculptor's pattern had grown clear. The final act would unfold at midnight on New Year's Eve. Jenna tightened her grip on the steaming coffee cup in her hands. The murders weren't just gruesome, they were meticulously planned, each one leaving behind clues as if the killer wanted them to solve their puzzle. But no matter how fast the task force worked, they always seemed to arrive too late. Her partner, Harlan Reed, appeared beside her, his face grim. "They found another clock," he said. "No body yet, but it's identical to the others. Bethesda Terrace, Central Park. Frozen at 10 p.m. Jenna swore under her breath. The timeline was narrowing. The sculptor was moving closer to midnight, and they were running out of time to stop them. "We need to lock down Times Square," she said. "If this pattern holds, the next move will be here, and we can't afford any mistakes." Harlan nodded, but his expression was skeptical. "Lock down Times Square on New Year's Eve? That's a logistical nightmare, even if we get the mayor on board." "It's not a suggestion, Harlan. It's a necessity," Jenna snapped. "The sculptor isn't going to stop unless we stop them first." As the task force mobilized, Jenna returned to the precinct to pore over the case files again. The victims seemed random on the surface: a school teacher, a cab driver, a museum curator. But they shared a common thread. They were all connected to time. The curator had organized an exhibit on ancient timepieces. The cab driver's route regularly passed the iconic Grand Central Clock. The teacher ran a local history club, with a focus on the evolution of public clocks in New York City. Jenna's brow furrowed as she flipped through photos of the crime scenes. Each location was tied to New York's identity: the Bryant Park skating rink, the Manhattan Bridge, and now Bethesda Terrace. Together, they formed a map of the sculptor's twisted obsession. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Harlan stepped in, holding a folder. "You need to see this," he said, placing it on the desk. Inside were reports from the forensics team. The clocks left at the scenes weren't just ordinary antiques. Each was custom-made, the gears and mechanisms engraved with intricate designs, and each clock had a faint trace of the same material, a rare type of lacquer used in high-end watchmaking. "Whoever the sculptor is, they're either a watchmaker or someone with access to this level of craftsmanship," Harlan said. Jenna nodded, her mind racing. "And they're using the clocks to send a message. Each one ties into the murders, the locations, and the countdown to midnight." The connection was becoming clearer, but it didn't make stopping the sculptor any easier. Jenna felt the weight of the city's collective breath, held in anticipation of the new year. The sculptor wasn't just targeting individuals, they were targeting New York itself. Back in Times Square, preparations for the midnight celebration continued unabated. Jenna and Harlan joined the growing team of officers stationed throughout the area. As they navigated the maze of barricades and security checkpoints, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing directly into the sculptor's hands. "They want us here," she said, glancing at Harlan. "This isn't just about creating chaos, it's about control. They've orchestrated this entire night and we're following their script." Harlan frowned but didn't argue. "If that's true, then what's the end game?" Jenna's jaw tightened. "We find them before they show us." As the final hours of the year slipped away, Jenna and Harlan patrolled the streets surrounding Times Square. The festive atmosphere felt suffocating, the laughter and cheers a sharp contrast to the darkness they knew was lurking nearby. At 11 p.m., Jenna's radio crackled with a chilling report. Another body had been found, this time on the observation deck of Rockefeller Center. A golden clock rested beside the victim, its hands frozen at 11:15 p.m. The sculptor was closing in on their finale, and Jenna knew they had little time left. Every move the killer made brought them closer to midnight and closer to an act that could shake the city to its core. The observation deck of Rockefeller Center had become an eerie crime scene, illuminated by the city's glow. The latest victim, a young woman in an evening gown, lay sprawled near the edge of the deck, her lifeless eyes reflecting the city skyline. A golden clock rested in her hand, its hands frozen at 11:15 p.m. Detective Jenna Morales stood over the scene, her stomach twisting. The woman looked like she'd been heading to a New Year's Eve party, the shimmer of her dress catching the light. She didn't fit the same profile as the earlier victims, at least not at first glance. "She's different," Harlan said, echoing her thoughts. Jenna crouched beside the clock, her gloved fingers tracing its intricate carvings. Different, but not random. The sculptor doesn't make mistakes. Nearby, the forensics team worked quickly, snapping photos and collecting evidence. Jenna stood and walked to the edge of the deck, looking down at the bustling city below. Rockefeller Center was a prime spot, teeming with holiday tourists. The killer had chosen it deliberately. Harlan joined her, his face grim. "If the clocks are marking the murders, we've got 45 minutes until midnight. If they're planning something big, this is their countdown." "And we still don't know where they'll strike next," Jenna said. Harlan handed her a tablet displaying the map of the city. He pointed to the marked locations: Bryant Park, the Manhattan Bridge, Bethesda Terrace, and now Rockefeller Center. Each was a place tied to New York's identity and to time itself. "There's a pattern here," Harlan said, tapping the screen. "But it's not just the locations. The times on the clocks. They're part of it too. It's like they're counting up to something." Jenna stared at the map, the pieces swirling in her mind. The times on the clocks weren't random. They had to mean something more. What if it's not just the locations or the victims? What if it's the intervals between the murders? Harlan's brow furrowed. "Go on." The first victim's clock was frozen at 9 p.m., the second, 9:45 p.m., then 10:30 p.m. and now 11:15 p.m., Jenna said, the sculptors following a precise timeline, 45 minutes between each murder. Harlan nodded slowly. "And the last interval ends at midnight." Jenna's pulse quickened as the realization hit her. That's the pattern. They're using time itself as their canvas, and the final piece of their masterpiece happens at midnight. The urgency of their task was overwhelming. Jenna pulled out her phone and called the precinct. "We need all available units on Times Square," she said. "The sculptor's final move is going to happen there." The city was a blur of sirens and flashing lights as the NYPD mobilized. Officers streamed into Times Square, weaving through the throngs of revelers. Jenna and Harlan moved quickly, scanning the massive crowd for anything out of place. The countdown clock loomed overhead, its bright numbers ticking closer to midnight. Jenna's radio buzzed with constant updates, but none of them brought any leads. "They're here somewhere," Jenna said, her voice tense. "They've planned this too carefully to be anywhere else." Harlan pointed to the ball drop platform, where security teams were conducting sweeps. "If they're targeting the city's most iconic moment, that's where they'll strike." Jenna nodded, her mind racing. The sculptor's murders weren't just about the victims. They were about the city itself, its rhythms, its symbols, its identity. Midnight in Times Square was the ultimate symbol of New York, and the sculptor intended to make it theirs. As the clock struck 11:45 p.m., Jenna's radio crackled again. "Possible suspect spotted near the ball drop platform," an officer reported. Jenna and Harlan exchanged a glance before pushing through the crowd. The platform was heavily guarded, but the throng of people made it easy for anyone to slip by unnoticed. They arrived to find officers detaining a man in a dark coat. He looked disheveled and confused, his face pale. Jenna's gut told her he wasn't the sculptor. "He was acting suspicious, hovering near the equipment," one officer said. Jenna studied the man's face, searching for signs of deceit. "Let him go," she said finally. "The sculptor isn't sloppy. They wouldn't get caught this easily." Harlan sighed as the officers released the man. "We're running out of time." Jenna stared at the platform, her mind working furiously. The clocks. They've been a clue every time. What if there's another one here? They split up, searching the area. Jenna's heart pounded as she scanned the crowd, the platform, the surrounding buildings. Then she saw it, a glint of gold near a barricade. She rushed over, crouching to examine the object. It was a golden clock, identical to the others, its hands frozen at 11:50 p.m. Harlan appeared beside her, his face grim. 10 minutes to midnight. Jenna stood, her resolve hardening. This is it, the sculptor's final move is about to begin. The golden clock Jenna found near the barricade felt heavier in her hands than it should have. Its intricate engravings shimmered under the neon lights of Times Square, and its frozen hands pointed to 11:50 p.m. It was a message, unmistakably left by the Sculptor of Time. Jenna handed the clock to Harlan as her radio crackled. Units on site, be advised. All officers sweep Times Square for suspicious packages or individuals. Priority is the ball drop platform and surrounding rooftops. We're running out of time, Harlan muttered, tucking the clock into an evidence bag. 10 minutes, and this place will be chaos, if we don't find them now. We will, Jenna interrupted, her voice firm. She scanned the sea of revelers, thousands of faces blurring together. Somewhere in the crowd, the sculptor was hiding, biding their time until the final stroke of midnight. Her earpiece crackled again. Dispatch to all units. We've got a report of drones circling the area. Possible connection to the suspect. Jenna's stomach sank. Drones? Harlan frowned. Could be delivering something. Explosives? Jenna grabbed her radio. Focus on the drones. Track their movement and find where they're being controlled from. The crowd's energy continued to swell as the clock ticked closer to midnight. Confetti cannons fired sporadically, and cheers erupted with each passing second. But Jenna felt none of the revelry, only the tightening noose of dread. This isn't just about chaos, she said, her voice low as they walked toward the ball drop platform. The sculptor's been methodical from the start. Each murder, each location, it's all been leading here. There's a bigger purpose behind this. And you think they'll reveal it at midnight? Harlan asked. Jenna nodded. Whatever happens, it's going to be public. The sculptor wants the whole city to see their finale. They reached the platform, where security teams were sweeping for anything suspicious. Jenna's eyes darted to the massive clock counting down above the square. 6 minutes to midnight. Anything? She asked one of the officers. Nothing so far, he replied, shaking his head. No explosives, no tampering with the ball drop system. Jenna's frustration mounted. The sculptor had planned this night down to the second. There had to be something they were missing. Her radio buzzed again. Detective Morales, we've got movement on the drones. They're circling back toward the square, low altitude. Looks like they're dropping something. Dropping what? Jenna demanded. Small devices, unknown purpose, sending units to recover. The tension in the air became palpable as Jenna and Harlan rushed toward the center of the square, dodging through the crowd. The revelers, oblivious to the danger, cheered as the drones buzzed overhead, scattering metallic objects onto the streets. Jenna picked one up, a small palm-sized clock with its hands frozen at 11:55 p.m. Another clock, she said, holding it up for Harlan to see. Everywhere at once, Harlan muttered, looking around. They're spreading them throughout the crowd. A terrifying realization dawned on Jenna. It's not just one event. The sculptor's turning the entire square into their stage. The radio crackled again, this time with panic in the officer's voice. We've got another body. Rooftop of the new Victory Theater, frozen clock in their hand, 11:57 p.m. Jenna's blood ran cold. 2 minutes, she whispered. They sprinted toward the theater, the crowd's cheers and countdown growing louder with each step. When they reached the rooftop, the sight that greeted them was grim. A man slumped against the ledge, his throat slashed, another golden clock in his hand. It's escalating, Harlan said. They're speeding up. Jenna's eyes scanned the rooftop and the surrounding buildings. Where are you? She murmured under her breath. Then she saw it. A faint glimmer on a rooftop across the square. A figure in a dark coat, standing perfectly still, watching the chaos below. There, she said, pointing. That's him. Harlan followed her gaze, drawing his weapon. Let's go. They scrambled down the fire escape and darted through the crowd, racing toward the adjacent building. The final seconds of the year ticked away as the city's collective voice grew to a roar. They reached the rooftop just as the clock struck 11:59 p.m. The figure stood at the edge, his golden mask glinting in the light of the massive screens below. Jenna raised her gun, her voice steady. "Don't move, it's over." The figure turned slowly, his mask an intricate design of clock faces and swirling patterns. "Is it?" the distorted voice replied. Jenna took a step forward. "Drop whatever you're holding, now." The sculptor tilted his head, their hand holding a small device. "You've made it just in time," they said. "The moment the whole city's been waiting for." The countdown hit its final seconds, the crowd chanting in unison. 10, 9, 8. Jenna lunged forward, her hand reaching for the device. 7, 6. The sculptor twisted away, his laughter echoing through the night. 5, 4. Jenna shouted. "Harlan, cut them off!" 3, 2. The sculptor pressed the button. 1. The moment the countdown hit 0, the crowd in Times Square erupted into deafening cheers. Confetti rained from above, lights flashed, and the New Year's ball completed its descent in a blaze of glittering brilliance. But high above the chaos on a rooftop overlooking the square, time seemed to freeze. Jenna Morales and Harlan Reed stood face to face with the Sculptor of Time, the golden-masked killer whose twisted artistry had brought the city to its knees. Jenna's heart pounded as the sculptor's thumb hovered over the button on the device in his hand. "Drop it," she shouted, her gun aimed steady. The sculptor tilted his head, the mask's clock-like face glinting in the fireworks. "You've come so far, detective," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos below. "Do you even know what you've walked into?" Before Jenna could respond, the fireworks shifted. The explosions turned synchronized, eerily precise. The shapes he created weren't random bursts of light. They formed the face of a clock in the sky, ticking toward a single moment. Midnight. "What did you do?" Jenna demanded, stepping closer. "Everything," the sculptor replied, his voice filled with sinister pride. "The countdown was never about the ball drop. It's about what happens after." Jenna lunged for the device, but the sculptor was faster, sidestepping and pressing the button. The rooftop beneath them shook, and a low rumble spread through the city like a wave. "Jenna!" Harlan shouted, grabbing her arm as she stumbled. Below, the crowd's cheers faltered. People began pointing toward the screens that surrounded Times Square. Every single one flickered, the advertisements replaced with a single image, the golden clock motif that had marked each of the sculptor's murders. A distorted voice boomed from the speakers, cutting through the celebration. "Happy New Year, New York. Time is fleeting, but art is eternal." The rumbling grew louder, and Jenna's stomach dropped as she realized what was happening. Across the city, synchronized explosions lit up the skyline. Small calculated blasts erupted at key landmarks, bridges, skyscrapers, subway stations. "Controlled demolitions," Harlan said, his voice filled with horror. The sculptor stepped to the edge of the rooftop, arms outstretched as if he was conducting an orchestra. "Behold my masterpiece," he said, his voice reverent. Jenna fired a shot, aiming for the sculptor's hand. The device flew from his grasp, clattering to the ground, but it was too late. The destruction had already begun. "Shut it down!" Jenna yelled, grabbing the device. "It can't be stopped," the sculptor said with a laugh. "It's all in motion. Midnight was the culmination of years of planning, and you, detective, were the perfect audience." Jenna ignored him, her fingers working furiously to decipher the device's controls. The screen was a maze of countdowns and schematics, each tied to a different location. Harlan grabbed the sculptor, slamming him against the rooftop wall. "How do we stop him?" he demanded. "You can't," the sculptor said, his voice serene. "You can only witness the beauty of its execution." Jenna's mind raced. The explosions weren't designed to destroy the entire city, just enough to cause panic and fear, to leave a mark on New York's history. But there had to be a way to disrupt the chain reaction. "Help me," she snapped at Harlan. He shoved the sculptor into a corner and rushed to her side. Together, they examined the device, their hands moving in tandem. "It's a network," Jenna said. "Each location is linked to the others. If we can disrupt the signal—" "The drones," Harlan interrupted. "They're part of the relay." Jenna nodded. "We take out the drones, we cut the connection." She grabbed her radio. "All units, target the drones. Bring them down now." The response was immediate. Officers across the square opened fire, aiming at the small, buzzing machines that hovered above the crowd. One by one, the drones fell, their blinking lights extinguished. On the rooftop, the device in Jenna's hands began to sputter. The countdowns froze, and the rumbling across the city started to subside. "No!" the sculptor shouted, his calm veneer cracking for the first time. "You can't undo my work." Jenna turned to him, her face set in determination. "Watch me." With one final command, she disabled the device entirely. The rooftop fell silent except for the distant sounds of sirens and the murmurs of a confused crowd below. Harlan moved to cuff the sculptor, who now stood motionless, his golden mask gleaming under the fireworks. "You're done," he said, his voice cold. But the sculptor laughed softly. "Am I? Or have I just immortalized myself in your city's history?" Jenna stepped closer, yanking off the mask. Beneath it was a face she didn't recognize. Ordinary, unremarkable, the face of someone who could easily disappear into a crowd. "Why?" she demanded. The sculptor smiled. "Because time is fleeting, detective, and now I'll live forever." As the first sunrise of the new year broke over the city, Jenna looked out at the skyline. The sculptor's plan had been stopped, but the scars on the city would remain. And so would the memory of the killer who had turned time itself into the ultimate weapon. Now that you've experienced fireworks, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to find out which American Killscape is next.